There is a specific moment in the existence of every empire when the balance finally tips. It does not occur with a dramatic collapse or with invading armies marching through the capital city, but rather with something far quieter and far more humiliating. It is a signature on a piece of paper, a handshake across a polished mahogany desk, or a wire transfer between two banks separated by an ocean that effectively rewrites the entire global order. For the British Empire, that definitive moment arrived in the winter of 1945 inside a stuffy conference room in Washington, D.C., and the man sent to negotiate the terms of Britain's survival was already dying. His name was John Maynard Keynes, and he was arguably the most brilliant economist the 20th century ever produced. He had fundamentally reshaped how the world understood money, employment, and the role of government in preventing economic catastrophe. But in the autumn of 1945, none of that intellectual prestige mattered. Keynes was not in Washington to theorize. He was there to beg. Britain, the nation that had stood alone against Nazi Germany when every other European power had either fallen or surrendered, was now flat broke. Its treasury was empty and its debts were staggering. Its empire, which stretched across a quarter of the Earth's surface, was bleeding money faster than it could be counted. And the only nation on the planet with the cash to save it was the United States of America, a country that had every reason to let the British Empire die. This is the story of the 1946 Anglo-American loan, the financial agreement that most history books gloss over, but which many economists and historians consider the single most important transaction of the 20th century. It is the story of how America purchased Britain's obedience, dismantled its trade empire, dethroned the world's reserve currency, and set the stage for every act of decolonization that followed from India to Africa to the Middle East. It is the story of how the so-called special relationship between Britain and America was never really special at all. It was transactional, and the price of the transaction was the British Empire itself. To understand why Britain found itself on its knees in 1945, you have to understand what 6 years of total war actually did to the country, not just in human lives, but in raw economic terms. When the war began in 1939, Britain was still the center of the largest empire the world had ever seen. The pound sterling was one of the most powerful currencies on the planet. London was the undisputed financial capital of the globe. British companies dominated trade routes from Singapore to Suez, and the sterling area, a system in which dozens of countries pegged their currencies to the pound and traded primarily within the British economic orbit, gave London an extraordinary degree of control over global commerce. But war changes everything, and total war, the kind that demands every factory, every worker, and every ounce of national energy be redirected toward survival, changes everything permanently. What happened to Britain between 1939 and 1945 was not merely a period of hardship. It was a complete economic transformation, one that hollowed out the financial foundations upon which 3 centuries of imperial power had been built. Think about what total war actually means in economic terms. It means converting automobile factories into tank factories. It means redirecting steel that would have gone into bridges and buildings into the hulls of warships. It means pulling women out of homes and into munitions plants. It means rationing food so severely that the average British citizen was eating less in 1943 than at almost any point in modern history. It means telling an entire nation that everything they produce, everything they earn, and everything they consume must serve the singular purpose of survival. By 1945, roughly 55% of Britain's gross domestic product was being consumed by the war effort. That is an almost incomprehensible figure. More than half of everything the nation produced, every pound of steel, every gallon of fuel, and every hour of labor was being poured into the machinery of war. To put that in perspective, even the Soviet Union, which bore the heaviest military burden of any Allied power, devoted a smaller share of its economy to the fight. The United States, despite its enormous military contributions, never exceeded about 40%. This meant that Britain had essentially stopped exporting anything. Before the war, British exports had been the lifeblood of the economy, generating the foreign currency needed to pay for imports, food, and raw materials. By 1943, British exports had collapsed to roughly 30% of their pre-war levels. The country was importing vastly more than it was selling, and it was paying for the difference by liquidating everything it owned overseas. Britain sold off foreign investments at a staggering rate. Before the war, Britain held approximately £4.5 billion in overseas assets, investments in railways, plantations, mines, and companies across the globe. These were the financial tentacles of empire, and they generated income that flowed back to London year after year. By 1945, a massive portion of those assets had been sold, many of them at fire sale prices, just to keep the war machine running. The country had gone from the world's largest creditor to the world's largest debtor in the span of 6 years. The debts were enormous. During the war, Britain had accumulated what were called sterling balances, essentially IOUs owed to countries across the empire, particularly India, Egypt, and other colonies that had supplied men, materials, and resources to the British war effort. These countries held their earnings in pounds sterling in accounts in London, effectively lending Britain the money to fight the war. By 1945, those sterling balances had ballooned to approximately £3.5 billion. That money was owed, and those countries wanted it back. Meanwhile, Britain's physical infrastructure was battered. German bombing raids had devastated industrial centers and ports. Railways were in disrepair. Coal mines, the beating heart of British industry, were running on equipment that was decades old. Housing was in crisis, and the British people, who had endured years of rationing, blackouts, and bombardment, were exhausted in a way that is difficult to overstate. It was in this context that a quiet, internal British government memo used a phrase that would echo through the corridors of power for decades. The memo described Britain's financial situation as a financial Dunkirk. Just as the military evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940 had been a moment of existential crisis masked as a narrow escape, Britain's economic position in 1945 was equally dire. The country had won the war, but it had bankrupted itself in the process. And then, with the war barely over, the financial lifeline that had kept Britain breathing was suddenly ripped away. The lifeline in question was Lend-Lease. Introduced in March of 1941, Lend-Lease was the program through which the United States supplied Britain with food, fuel, weapons, ships, aircraft, and raw materials. It was not charity. It was not even a loan in the traditional sense. It was a mechanism that allowed the United States to support the Allied war effort without technically entering the war as a direct combatant, at least in the early stages. President Franklin Roosevelt had likened it to lending a neighbor a garden hose when their house was on fire. You do not haggle over the price, you put out the fire first. Over the course of the war, the United States provided Britain with approximately $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid, an almost unthinkable sum that represented the single largest transfer of resources between two nations in human history up to that point. Without it, Britain simply could not have continued fighting. The country did not have the dollars to pay for the food its people ate, let alone the weapons its soldiers carried. But Lend-Lease was always understood to be a wartime measure. The legislation itself contained specific provisions limiting its use to the duration of hostilities. And so, when Japan formally surrendered on September 2, 1945, President Harry Truman did what the law required him to do. He terminated Lend-Lease. The termination was abrupt, almost shockingly so. Ships that were already at sea loaded with goods bound for Britain were recalled or diverted. Supplies that were sitting in warehouses waiting to be shipped were suddenly reclassified. What had been aid was now merchandise, and Britain was expected to pay for it in cash, in dollars. The British government was blindsided. Prime Minister Clement Attlee, who had just won a landslide election on a platform of building a welfare state, creating a national health service, and modernizing British industry, suddenly found himself staring into a financial abyss. Britain did not have the dollars to pay for what it needed to import. It did not have the export capacity to earn those dollars, and its debts, both to the sterling area countries and to the United States itself, were mounting by the day. Attlee's government had one option. They had to go to Washington and ask for money, and the man they sent was Keynes. John Maynard Keynes arrived in Washington in early September of 1945, leading a British delegation that included Lord Halifax, the British ambassador, and a team of Treasury officials and economic advisors. Keynes was 62 years old, and his health was failing badly. He had suffered a severe heart attack in 1937 that had nearly killed him. He had spent 2 years as a semi-invalid before returning to government service during the war. The transatlantic crossings, The long hours of negotiation, the stress of fighting for Britain's financial survival, all of it had taken a visible toll on his body. He was gaunt. He was exhausted. He was, by all accounts, running on sheer willpower. But Keynes was also brilliant, charming, and supremely confident, perhaps too confident. He arrived in Washington believing he could secure a grant in aid, a gift, a recognition from the United States that Britain's wartime sacrifices entitled it to generous financial support with no strings attached. In Keynes's view, Britain had fought alone for 2 years before America entered the war. Britain had borne losses that were disproportionate to its size and wealth. Britain had been America's most loyal ally. Surely, he thought, the Americans would recognize this and respond with generosity. He was catastrophically wrong. The Americans had a very different perspective. From Washington's point of view, the United States had already been extraordinarily generous. $31 billion in Lend-Lease was not a small sum. American taxpayers had funded the largest military operation in history, and many in Congress were deeply reluctant to extend any further financial aid to a foreign power, even an ally. There was also a widespread suspicion, particularly among Republican lawmakers, that Britain was exaggerating its financial difficulties to extract money from the United States while simultaneously maintaining its vast and expensive empire. And then there was the deeper strategic calculation, one that went beyond any individual politician's skepticism. The United States in 1945 was the most powerful nation on earth. Its industrial base was intact, its economy was booming, its military was unmatched, and its policymakers had a clear vision of the post-war world they wanted to build. That vision was rooted in free trade, open markets, multilateral institutions, and the dismantlement of the old European colonial trade blocs that had, in America's view, contributed to the economic nationalism and trade wars of the 1930s. The British Empire, with its system of imperial preference, its sterling area, its closed trading networks, and its colonial monopolies, was everything the United States wanted to tear down. Imperial preference was a system of tariffs established at the Ottawa Conference of 1932 that gave preferential trade terms to goods produced within the British Empire. It meant that Australian wool, Canadian wheat, Indian textiles, and South African gold all moved through channels that benefited London at the expense of outsiders, including American exporters. The sterling area reinforced this by ensuring that countries within Britain's economic orbit kept their reserves in pounds, traded primarily among themselves, and looked to London, not New York, as their financial center. For the United States, the loan negotiations were not just about helping a struggling ally. They were about reshaping the global economic order, and the price of American money would be British compliance with American rules. The negotiations were brutal. They lasted 3 months from September to December of 1945, and they were characterized by what one historian described as severe clashes and hard wrangling. On the American side, the key negotiators included Fred Vinson, the Secretary of the Treasury, Dean Acheson, the Under-Secretary of State, and William Clayton, the Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs. Clayton, a Texas cotton magnate and a devout free trader, was particularly aggressive in pushing for conditions that would pry open British markets and dismantle imperial preference. Keynes found himself outmaneuvered at almost every turn. His initial demand for a grant was rejected outright. His fallback position, an interest-free loan, was also rejected. The Americans made it clear that any financial assistance would come in the form of a commercial loan with interest and with conditions attached. Those conditions were the real weapon. The Americans demanded 3 things that would prove devastating to British economic sovereignty and ultimately to the survival of the British Empire itself. The first condition was that Britain had to agree to make the pound sterling convertible into dollars within 1 year of the loan being ratified. This meant that anyone holding pounds, whether they were British citizens, Indian merchants, Egyptian cotton traders, or Australian exporters, could walk into a bank and exchange their sterling for American dollars. On the surface, this sounded like a reasonable step toward creating a free and open international monetary system. In practice, it was a ticking time bomb. The second condition was that Britain had to begin dismantling the system of imperial preference. The preferential tariffs that bound the empire's trade together, that gave British companies an advantage in colonial markets, and gave colonial producers an advantage in Britain would have to be progressively reduced and eventually eliminated. This struck at the very economic architecture of the empire. The third condition was that Britain had to join and support the new international institutions, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, that had been designed at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. These institutions, while nominally multilateral, were dominated by the United States and operated according to American priorities. The dollar, not the pound, would be the anchor of the new global monetary system. Keynes fought against these terms. He argued, he cajoled, he deployed every ounce of his formidable intellect. In private, he was furious. He understood exactly what the Americans were doing. They were using Britain's desperation as leverage to remake the global financial system in their own image. But he also understood that Britain had no alternative. Without the loan, the country would face what he himself had called a financial Dunkirk. There would be no dollars to buy food, no dollars to pay for essential imports, no dollars to maintain the military garrisons that policed the empire from Palestine to Malaya. As Keynes himself wrote in 1946, the American loan was primarily required to meet the political and military expenditure overseas. He estimated that Britain was spending approximately £2 billion on policing and administering the empire. This was the essential paradox. The loan was not really about rebuilding Britain. It was about keeping the empire alive just a little longer, and the conditions attached to the loan were designed to make that task progressively more impossible. In December of 1945, the agreement was finally signed. The United States would lend Britain $3.75 billion at 2% interest to be repaid over 50 years starting in 1951. Canada contributed an additional $1.19 billion. As part of the settlement, Britain's outstanding Lend-Lease balance was written off for $650 million, a fraction of its original value. Now the loan had to be ratified. And this is where the story becomes even more revealing because the debates in both the British Parliament and the United States Congress expose the raw nerves of two nations grappling with the realities of a shifting world order. In Britain, the debate was agonizing. Conservatives saw the loan as a national humiliation, a forced surrender of the empire's economic sovereignty to the United States. Leopold Amery, the former Secretary of State for India and Burma, was one of the most vocal critics. He argued that the conditions attached to the loan, particularly the requirement to dismantle imperial preference, amounted to an act of economic sabotage against the empire itself. In his view, the Americans were not helping Britain, they were buying it. Members of the Labour Party were divided as well. Some, like Emmanuel Shinwell, the Minister of Fuel and Power, believed that accepting the loan was a betrayal of the planned economy that Labour had been elected to build. Others recognized that without the money, the government's entire domestic program, including the National Health Service and the nationalization of key industries, would be impossible to finance. Winston Churchill, now leader of the opposition, found himself in a particularly uncomfortable position. He personally recognized the necessity of the loan and worked behind the scenes to help secure its passage. But many members of his own party were in open revolt, viewing the agreement as a capitulation that Churchill himself should have been fighting against. When the vote finally came, it passed, but with deep resentment on all sides. Members from across the political spectrum felt that Britain had been forced to accept terms that were stacked overwhelmingly in America's favor. In the United States, the debate was no less contentious. Many members of Congress were deeply reluctant to lend money to a foreign government, particularly one that still maintained a vast empire. Republican lawmakers questioned why American taxpayers should subsidize Britain's colonial adventures. Some argued that the loan was too generous. Others worried that the money would never be repaid, pointing to Britain's default on its World War I debts during the 1930s. President Truman submitted the agreement to Congress in January of 1946, and it took months of intense lobbying before the vote was held. On July 13, 1946, the House of Representatives approved the loan by a vote of 218 to 155. It was not an overwhelming endorsement. The Senate concurred shortly after, and Truman signed the agreement into law on July 15th. The money began flowing. But here's the thing that makes this story so devastating. The loan was supposed to stabilize Britain. It was supposed to give the country breathing room to rebuild its economy, restructure its industries, and transition from a wartime footing to a peacetime one. Instead, it accelerated the very collapse it was meant to prevent. And the mechanism of that acceleration was the convertibility clause. Under the terms of the agreement, Britain was required to make sterling freely convertible into dollars by July of 1947. This meant that any country or individual holding pounds could exchange them for American dollars at the prevailing rate. The theory was elegant. An open convertible currency would promote free trade, encourage investment, and integrate Britain into the new American-dominated global economic system. The reality was catastrophic. When convertibility went into effect on July 15, 1947, exactly 1 year after the loan was signed into law, the result was an immediate and devastating run on the pound. Countries that had been forced to hold their reserves in sterling during the war, countries like India, Egypt, and Australia, countries that were owed billions in sterling balances, suddenly had the opportunity to convert those holdings into dollars, and they did. The drain was breathtaking. In the first 5 weeks alone, more than two-thirds of the remaining loan proceeds were consumed as holders of sterling rushed to convert their pounds into dollars. The British Treasury was hemorrhaging money at a rate that nobody had anticipated. Between the 10th and the 15th of August alone, approximately $175 million in reserves were lost. On August 17th, the British cabinet met in emergency session. The debate was short and grim. The government had no choice but to suspend convertibility. On August 19th, 1947, just 35 days after it had begun, the experiment was over. Sterling was no longer convertible. The loan money was largely gone, and Britain was right back where it had started. Only now it had also demonstrated to the entire world that the pound was not strong enough to survive in an open market. The crisis of 1947 was more than a financial embarrassment. It was a geopolitical earthquake. It destroyed what remained of the pound's credibility as an international reserve currency. It demonstrated that the sterling area, the network of countries that had pegged their currencies to the pound and traded within Britain's economic orbit, was a hollow shell. And it signaled to every colony, every dominion, and every territory within the British Empire that London could no longer guarantee financial stability, that the center could no longer hold. The timing was not coincidental. Just weeks before the convertibility crisis erupted, Britain had announced that it would grant independence to India, partitioning the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. The decision, which took effect on August 15, 1947, was driven by many factors: political, social, and moral. But the financial dimension is impossible to ignore. India held roughly one-third of the total sterling balances owed by Britain, approximately £1.2 billion. Maintaining control over a restive subcontinent of 400 million people while simultaneously owing them an astronomical debt was simply untenable. The empire was bleeding financially, and India was the largest wound. And it was not just India. In February of 1947, Britain had informed the United States that it could no longer afford to provide military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey, two countries that were seen as critical bulwarks against Soviet expansion into the Mediterranean. This British withdrawal forced the United States to step in, leading directly to the announcement of the Truman Doctrine in March of 1947, the formal declaration that the United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The Truman Doctrine is widely regarded as the opening salvo of the Cold War, and it was triggered in large part by Britain's financial inability to maintain its global commitments. The following year, in 1948, the United States launched the Marshall Plan, a massive program of economic aid to Western Europe that dwarfed the Anglo-American loan in both scale and ambition. Crucially, Marshall Plan aid was provided as grants, not loans. The money did not have to be repaid. This was the generosity that Keynes had sought and been denied 3 years earlier. But by then, the political calculus had shifted. The Cold War was now underway, and the United States needed a stable, prosperous, pro-American Western Europe as a bulwark against Soviet communism. Marshall Plan aid came without the punitive conditions that had been attached to the British loan because the strategic imperative had changed. For Britain, the irony was bitter, almost unbearably so. The country that had fought the longest, suffered the most, and sacrificed the most during the war had been forced to accept a loan on commercial terms with crushing conditions. The countries that had been occupied, bombed into rubble, or had collaborated with the enemy received grants with no strings attached. West Germany, the nation that had started the war, that had bombed London into rubble during the Blitz, that had marched its armies across Europe, would receive Marshall Plan aid that dwarfed what Britain received, and none of it had to be repaid. France, which had capitulated to Germany in 6 weeks and spent most of the war under the Vichy regime, received generous American support with far fewer conditions. Italy, which had fought alongside Hitler until 1943, was treated with a degree of financial clemency that the British found almost insulting. As one British commentator bitterly observed, it seemed as though being a loyal ally was less profitable than being a defeated enemy. The lesson for future generations was stark. In the cold calculus of geopolitics, loyalty is a sentiment, leverage is a fact. The consequences of the 1946 loan rippled outward for decades. The convertibility crisis of 1947 led directly to the devaluation of the pound in September of 1949, when the exchange rate was slashed from $4.03 per pound to $2.80, a drop of more than 30%. This devaluation was both an acknowledgement of reality and a further blow to British prestige. The loan itself took 61 years to repay. Britain made its final payment on December 29, 2006, a date chosen because it was the last working day of the year. The final installment was approximately $83 million to the United States and roughly $23.6 million to Canada. Along the way, Britain had suspended payments 6 times in 1956, 1957, 1964, 1965, 1968, and 1976. Each time because the exchange rates made repayment impractical. The suspensions themselves tell a story that mirrors the decline of British power with almost poetic precision. 1956 was the year of the Suez Crisis, arguably the single most humiliating episode in British post-war history, and the moment that finally shattered the illusion of Great Britain as an independent global power. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in July of 1956, Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to seize control of the waterway. In purely military terms, the operation was succeeding, but the United States was furious. President Eisenhower had not been consulted. The operation threatened to destabilize the Middle East at a critical moment in the Cold War, and Washington had the perfect weapon to bring its wayward ally to heel. Eisenhower threatened to sell American-held sterling bonds on the open market, a move that would have triggered a catastrophic collapse of the pound. He also blocked Britain's request to draw emergency funds from the International Monetary Fund and refused to delay the annual loan repayment. Faced with the prospect of total financial meltdown, the British government capitulated within days. Prime Minister Anthony Eden ordered a ceasefire and a withdrawal. He resigned shortly afterward, his health and his career both destroyed. Suez was the moment the world saw in vivid and undeniable terms what the 1946 loan had made structurally inevitable. Britain could not act against America's wishes because America controlled the financial architecture within which Britain operated. The country that holds the purse strings holds the power. That had been true since 1946. Suez simply made it impossible to deny any longer. And what of Keynes? The man who had negotiated the loan, who had fought for better terms and been defeated, who had returned to London exhausted and ill, did not live to see the consequences of his work. On April 21, 1946, just months after the loan agreement was signed, John Maynard Keynes died of a heart attack at his home in Sussex. He was 62 years old. His biographer, Robert Skidelsky, would later write that Keynes had given his life for his country as surely as if he had fallen on the field of battle. The strain of the negotiations, the transatlantic crossings, the long hours, the bitter disappointments, all of it had accelerated his decline. Lionel Robbins, who had accompanied Keynes to Washington, wrote in almost identical words that the negotiations had killed him. The tragedy of Keynes's death is not just personal, it is symbolic. He was the last in a line of British statesmen who genuinely believed that Britain could navigate the post-war world as an equal partner to the United States, that intelligence, eloquence, and moral authority could compensate for economic weakness. As Lord Halifax reportedly whispered to Keynes during the negotiations, "It's true they have the money bags, but we have all the brains." It was a comforting thought. It was also dangerously wrong, because the deeper truth of the 1946 loan is that it was not really a loan at all. It was a purchase agreement. The United States was buying the dismantlement of the British Empire's economic infrastructure, the sterling area, imperial preference, the closed colonial trade networks, and replacing it with an American-designed system of free trade, open markets, and dollar supremacy. The conditions attached to the loan were not incidental. They were the entire point. Consider what the United States gained. The requirement to dismantle imperial preference opened up markets across the British Empire to American exporters. The convertibility clause fatally weakened the pound and accelerated the shift of global financial power from London to New York. The insistence on British participation in the Bretton Woods institutions ensured that the post-war economic order would be built around American priorities and American money. And the financial dependence that the loan created gave Washington enormous leverage over British foreign policy for decades to come. The British Empire did not end on any single date. Decolonization was a long, messy, often violent process that unfolded over decades and was driven by forces that went far beyond any financial agreement. Nationalist movements, the moral bankruptcy of colonialism, the exhaustion of war, the pressure of Cold War politics, all of these played a role. But the 1946 loan was the financial mechanism that made imperial retreat inevitable. You cannot maintain an empire when you cannot pay for it. You cannot project power when your currency is collapsing. You cannot hold colonies when you owe them more money than you can ever repay. By the time Britain made its final loan payment in 2006, the empire was a distant memory. India, Pakistan, Burma, Malaya, Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, Jamaica, Hong Kong, and dozens of other territories had long since gained their independence. The sterling area had dissolved. The pound, while still a significant currency, was no longer the center of the global financial system. London remained an important financial center, but it operated within a framework designed by and for the United States. And perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of this entire story. We tend to think of empires ending through revolution, through war, through the heroic struggles of oppressed peoples throwing off the chains of colonial rule. And those struggles were real, and they matter. But sometimes empires end with a wire transfer. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is not a gun or a bomb or an army. It is a checkbook. And the nation that controls the checkbook controls the future. The United States understood this in 1945. Britain learned it the hard way, and the rest of the world is still living with the consequences. If this story changed the way you look at the hidden financial forces that dismantle empires and shape our modern world, please subscribe and like the channel. We are digging up the history that they tried to bury in the fine print of balance sheets. Let's keep uncovering the truth together. The next chapter of history will be open soon.